The High Council fire burned low, mirroring the last light of day dying against the red cliffs of the Arizona uplands. Saichi stood before the elders, her face a mask of stone, her posture rigid. She had not been bound, for there was nowhere to run. She was Apache, and this was her land, but it was no longer her home. The air was thick with the scent of juniper smoke and the heavy silence of judgment. The oldest of the council, a man called Gray Willow, whose eyes held the dryness of the desert itself, finally spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the twilight like an obsidian blade. "You have broken the sacred law," he said, his words in her own tongue, each one a separate blow. "You lay with the white man, the soldier." Saichi did not flinch. Her crime was known. She had loved a man with eyes the color of the washed-out sky, a man in a blue coat who had spoken of peace while his comrades brought wagons of rifles. He had called her his desert flower, and she, a fool, had believed him. She had shown him the hidden spring, the one her people used when the creeks ran dry. "He used your body to steal our water," Gray Willow continued, his voice void of pity. "He used your trust to find our stronghold. When the soldiers came, they knew the path. They knew our weakness. Because of you. 3 warriors are dead. 2 children are gone." Her heart, which she thought had turned to dust, clenched. The betrayal was not just hers. It was her gift to her people. The soldier had left with his regiment 2 weeks past, his promises dissolving like mist. He had never looked back. And when she had returned to her people, hollow and shamed, the survivors of the raid looked at her with eyes that held no recognition. She was a ghost to them. "Death is a mercy." Another elder, Stonehand, rasped. He had lost a son in the raid. "She does not deserve the honor of a clean death." Saichi kept her gaze fixed on the dying embers. She would not beg. She had dishonored them. She would accept the sentence. Gray Willow raised his hand. "Death ends the lesson. Exile teaches it. She will be cast out." A murmur moved through the small gathering. Exile was a hard fate. To be without a tribe was to be nothing, a leaf in the wind, belonging nowhere. "But not an ordinary exile," Gray Willow said, his eyes finding hers in the gloom. "She has shamed us by choosing a white man. She will live with her choice. She will be given to one of them. Not a soldier, not a man of power." He paused, letting the cruelty of the sentence settle. "We will take her to the lands of the settlers, to the edge of their territory. There is a farmer there, a man known to us. He lives on scorched land. He has no wife, no children. He starves slowly. He is poor in body and poor in spirit. He is nothing." The humiliation of it settled over Saichi, a shroud heavier than wool. She was to be property, a punishment, handed from one world to the next. "She will be his, to do with as he pleases," Gray Willow pronounced. "She will live out her days in the shadow of the people she chose over her own. She will see what a life with them truly is. She is no longer Apache. She is his payment for the land we let him keep. This is the sentence." There were no more words. The council rose, turning their backs to her. The judgment was complete. She was left alone by the cooling fire, the vast, cold stars of the desert night her only witnesses. 2 days later, she was marched west. The 2 warriors assigned to take her did not speak to her. They did not share their food with her. She ate only what she could forage on the brief stops. She walked until her moccasins were thin and her feet bled. She carried only a small pouch with a flint, a dry twist of herbs, and the clothes on her back. They moved out of the high canyons, down into the sprawling, sun-baked flatlands that the settlers favored, a place of dust and scrub brush. On the morning of the 3rd day, they stopped on a low ridge. Below them, in a shallow bowl of dry earth, sat a structure that hardly deserved the name of cabin. It was a shack, built of mismatched cottonwood planks and patched with sod. The roof sagged, and one of the front windows was covered over with scraped hide. A thin curl of smoke, pale and weak, rose from the mud and stick chimney. "There," one of the warriors said, his first word to her. He pointed. "That is the place." They walked her down the incline. A mule, its ribs stark beneath its dusty coat, stood tethered to a broken wagon wheel. Its head hung low. The ground around the cabin was cracked clay, showing the brown, withered stalks of what might have been a corn crop. It was a place of profound failure. The door of the cabin opened. A man stepped out, wiping his hands on his trousers. He was tall, but stooped, as if carrying a weight he had forgotten to set down. His hair was the color of dried grass, his beard untrimmed. He looked at the two warriors with a stillness that was not calm, but exhaustion. His eyes, when they lifted, were a flat, pale gray, like river stones in a dry bed. The first warrior spoke, not in Apache, but in the broken, clumsy English of the trading posts. "This woman, she is for you." The farmer, Matthew Bell, looked at Saichi. He took in her black hair, matted with dust, her rigid posture, the dark defiance in her eyes. He saw the Apache dress, the bearing of a woman who was not beaten, only condemned. His gaze was slow, unreadable. "I don't understand," Matthew said. His voice was rough, like dry gravel. "She is punishment," the warrior said. Shoving Saichi forward, she stumbled but did not fall. "From her people, to you. She stays here. You keep her." Matthew Bell's face did not change. He looked from the warrior to Saichi and back again. He seemed to be measuring a complex problem, one he had no tools to solve. He was a man drowning in inches of water, and they had just handed him a heavy stone. "I have no money to pay for her," he said. "No pay," the warrior said. He shook his head. "She is given a gift. You understand? She is yours." The concept hung in the hot, still air. Matthew looked at her again. He saw the bruising on her arm where the warrior had grabbed her. He saw that she was not looking at him, but past him, at the failed crop, her face empty. The two warriors turned. They did not look back. They walked up the ridge and disappeared over the rise, their task complete. Saichi and Matthew Bell were left alone. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the braying of the starved mule. He stood in the doorway. She stood in the dust. 10 yards separated them, but it was a chasm of language, of custom, of grief. Finally, he nodded, a short, jerky motion. "I have no food to spare," he said, as if that settled the matter. She did not respond. She did not know his words. He sighed, a long breath of dust and resignation. He stepped back from the door, holding it open. It was not an invitation. It was an acknowledgement of the inevitable. She walked past him, into the dim, hot interior of the shack. It was one room. The air was heavy with the smell of old smoke, sweat, and the faint, sweet odor of decay. A rough-hewn table with one chair stood in the center. A cold hearth dominated one wall. In the corner, a pallet of straw and thin blankets lay on the dirt floor. Above it, a crude ladder led to a low loft. Matthew entered behind her. He did not look at her. He walked to the hearth, picked up a tin cup, and drank the last of the water from a bucket, his back to her. He was a man who had lived alone for so long he had forgotten the shape of another person in his space. His wife, Sarah, had died in this room. He remembered the fever, the sound of her breathing growing thin, like paper. That was 4 years ago. Their son, born silent, had died 2 years before that. He had buried them both on the hill behind the shack, under the lone mesquite tree. All he had left was the land, and the land was trying to kill him. The drought had lasted 8 months. His well was nearly dry. His crops were skeletons. He spoke more to his mule, Jed, than he had to any human in a year. And now, this woman, this Apache, a punishment. The warrior had said. It felt true. Another mouth, another burden, another living thing to watch die. Night fell. The single room grew dark. Matthew lit a small tallow candle, its light weak. He took a piece of hardtack from a tin and chewed it slowly. He did not offer her any. He did not know what to do. He finished, then gestured to the pallet on the floor. "You," he said, pointing. Saichi looked at the pallet, then at him. She shook her head. She would not take his bed. She did not want his comfort. She walked to the opposite corner, near the door, and sat with her back against the rough planks, drawing her knees to her chest. Matthew watched her for a moment. He saw the set of her jaw. He grunted, a sound without meaning. He blew out the candle, plunging the room into blackness. Saichi heard the scrape of his boots on the ladder, then the creak of the loft boards as he settled. Silence returned. It was different now. It was shared. Saichi did not sleep. She waited. She listened to the man's breathing overhead, the heavy, slow rhythm of exhaustion. She heard the wind pick up outside, whistling through the cracks in the walls, carrying the fine, gritty dust that settled on her skin. She was an outcast. She had no people. She was the property of this white man, this settler who smelled of dry earth and failure. The humiliation burned in her throat, a cold fire. She would not stay. She would rather die in the desert, free, than live as a slave in this box of rotting wood. When his breathing deepened, sinking into the trough of heavy sleep, she rose. She moved with the silence her people had taught her, her feet making no sound on the packed dirt floor. She eased the door open. The wooden hinges gave a low groan. She froze. Above, the breathing continued, unchanged. She slipped out into the night. The moon was a thin sliver, offering almost no light. The air was cold, a sudden shock after the stifling cabin. She pulled her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders and began to walk, heading east, back toward the mountains she had come from. She walked for what felt like an hour, moving through the scrub and stones. This land was not hers. It was flat and exposed. There was no cover. She felt blind. She kept walking, fueled by a cold, sharp rage. Then she heard it, a low howl, cutting through the wind. It was answered by another, closer. Wolves. She stopped. She was in their territory, a lone figure in the dark. She scanned the blackness. She could see nothing, but she could feel them. She could smell the predators on the wind. A dry branch snapped to her left. A low growl followed. She saw the shape then, low to the ground, and beyond it, two pairs of eyes, reflecting the scant starlight. They were circling, testing her. She had no weapon. She had no fire. She was weak from the journey, from the lack of food. She thought of her people. They would not take her back. To them. She was already dead. She thought of the soldier, his blue eyes and easy lies. He was gone. She thought of the farmer, asleep in his loft, a man as empty as she was. The wolves were closing the distance. She could hear the soft padding of their feet on the hard earth. She had nowhere to go. To die here, torn apart by wolves, was a meaningless death. It was not the death of a warrior. It was the death of prey. Her pride, the only thing she had left, cracked. She turned, slowly, and began to walk back toward the cabin. The wolves shadowed her, staying just outside the range of a desperate lunge. They growled, frustrated, sensing her retreat. She walked, not ran, forcing her legs to move. Each step was a surrender. Each step took her further from who she was and deeper into what she had become. She reached the shack. The pale, weak outline of it was a bastion against the dark. She slipped back inside, barring the door. Her hands were shaking. She sank to the floor in her corner, pulling her knees tight. She heard the wolves howl again, this time a sound of frustration, fading as they moved on. She had tried to leave, The desert had refused her. Her tribe had exiled her. The white world had caged her. She was trapped. She listened to the wind and to the breathing of the man above, and for the first time since her judgment, Saichi put her head on her knees and wept, silent tears that made no sound, watering the dry earth floor of her new prison. When the first gray light of morning cut through the hide-covered window, Matthew Bell climbed down the ladder. He saw her in the corner, exactly where he had left her, but her posture was different. The rigid defiance was gone, replaced by a stillness that looked like polished stone. He saw the streaks of dust on her cheeks where the tears had dried. He saw her knuckles, white, where she gripped her blanket. He said nothing. He pulled on his worn boots, grabbed a tin bucket, and went outside. Saichi watched him go. She heard him at the well, the grating sound of the rope on the pulley. She heard him speak to the mule, his voice low and toneless. She stood up. Her body ached. She looked around the room. It was filthy. A thick layer of dust and grime covered everything. A pile of his clothes, stiff with dirt, lay near the hearth. She had a choice. She could sit in this corner and rot, or she could move. She chose to move. She found a broom, little more than a bundle of stiff grass tied to a stick, and began to sweep the floor. The dust rose in clouds, choking her, but she kept on, her motion stiff and angry. She swept the dirt out the open door. Matthew returned, carrying the bucket. It was only half full. The well was clearly failing. He stopped, watching her. She ignored him, sweeping around his feet as if he were a piece of furniture. He set the water down, dipped a cup, and drank. He looked at the pallet he had offered her, then at her. He said nothing. He went back outside. Saichi worked. She found a rag and wiped the caked grease from the small iron skillet. She scrubbed the table. She found his pile of mending, a coat with a torn elbow, a canvas water bag that was split at the seam. She sat, cross-legged, on the floor. She found his small mending kit, an awl, some tough sinew, a dull needle. Her hands, which had known how to bead intricate patterns and scrape hides, took up the new task. She patched the coat, her stitches small and even. She repaired the water bag, reinforcing the seam. She worked all day, fueled by a quiet, simmering fury. This was not service. This was survival. She would not live in filth. She would not be idle. When Matthew came in from the fields at dusk, his shoulders slumped. He stopped. The room was clean. The floor was bare earth, but it was clean. His coat was on the chair, the elbow neatly patched. The water bag sat by the bucket, repaired. A pot of water was on the low fire she had built. In it, boiling, was a handful of the dried beans he had in his stores, mixed with some roots she had dug from the hard earth just outside the door. It was a thin, meager soup, but it was hot. Saichi was back in her corner, her face turned toward the wall. Matthew Bell looked at the soup. He looked at the coat. He looked at her small, straight back. He felt a disturbance in the heavy silence of his life, a change he did not ask for and did not welcome. It was the complication of another human being. He ladled some of the soup into a wooden bowl. He tasted it. It was bland, but it was warm. He ladled another bowl and pushed it across the floor with his boot, until it stopped near her. She did not turn. He ate his soup, standing by the fire. He said nothing. He did not thank her. He did not know the word for what he felt. It was not gratitude. It was a dull acknowledgement. He finished, climbed the ladder, and lay down in his loft. She waited. Then she reached for the bowl. She ate, the first hot food she had tasted in days. The days that followed settled into this pattern. A harsh routine set in. As unyielding as the landscape, he would rise before the sun, tend his dying crop, and try to keep the mule alive. She would rise, clean the cabin, mend, and forage. She found patches of wild onion and edible weeds he had never known were there. She set snares, catching 2 rabbits in the first week. They did not speak. There was no language between them. They moved around each other, 2 ghosts trapped in a small box. Their only communication, the chores shared, the food left on the hearth. The silence was a living thing, a third person in the room. It was stretched taut, vibrating with mistrust, with anger, with a profound, shared loneliness. The desert wind was relentless. It blew for days at a time, a high, screaming noise that frayed the nerves. Sandstorms turned the sky a violent, hazy red, forcing them both inside the cramped cabin. During one such storm, they were trapped for 2 days. The wind hammered the walls, sand poured through the cracks, a fine, gritty silt that covered everything. Matthew sat at the table, sharpening his knife. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, the only sound. Saichi sat in her corner, weaving a small mat from dry grasses she had gathered. Her hands moved, the only part of her that seemed alive. He watched her hands. He saw the skill in them. He saw the scars. This woman was not the soft daughter of a chief. She was a worker. She was a survivor. She was, like him, utterly alone. He cleared his throat. She looked up, her eyes dark, guarded. He pointed to himself. Matthew. He said his own name. She stared at him. He pointed again. Matthew. She said nothing. She looked back down at her weaving. He felt a flush of irritation. He had tried. He went back to his knife. The scraping sound more aggressive now. The tension in the room was so thick he could taste it, like copper, like the dust that coated his tongue. She was a punishment. The warrior had been right. She was a living, breathing reminder of all the world's injustice, sitting in his corner, silent, judging him. And she, in her corner, felt his gaze. She felt his resentment. He was her jailer. This land was her prison. The wind shrieked, mocking them both. The string between them was taut, and it was beginning to sing. The mule, Jed, needed a stronger corral. The wind had worked 2 of the cottonwood posts loose, and the animal, dull as it was, had begun to notice. Matthew was out in the pale morning light, trying to set the post right, kicking the dry, stubborn earth with his boot. The ground was like iron. He cursed, low and without heat. Saichi came from the cabin. She carried the heavy tamping rod he had left by the door. She did not wait for him to ask. She walked to the post he was holding, kicked the loose stones away from the base, and began to work the rod, driving it into the earth, her movements economical and strong. Matthew watched, surprised. He held the post steady. She packed the earth, then pointed at the hole. He understood. He shoveled more dirt, and she tamped it again and again until the post was as solid as rock. They moved to the next one. He held the long, rough-hewn rail that had fallen. He needed to rest it on the post, but she was in the way. "Move," he said, gesturing. She looked at him, not understanding. He grunted, frustrated. He pointed at the rail. "Rail," he said, tapping the wood. "Hold the rail." She watched his mouth, the way it formed the sound. She looked at the long piece of wood. "Rail," she repeated. The sound was guttural, low in her throat, but it was the word. He nodded, a sharp, quick motion. He pointed to the tool in her hand. "Tamp." "Tamp," she said. He pointed at the shovel. "Shovel. Shovel." A new line had been crossed. He pointed at the mule. "Jed." She pointed at the pale, washed-out sky. "Sky," he said. She pointed to the hard ground beneath their feet. "Earth." She then pointed to the dry, skeletal bush by the fence line, the one with the pale thorns. "Chill," she said. It was her word. He tried to say it. "Chill." She shook her head, a small, impatient motion. "Chill." She tapped her throat, showing him where the sound came from. He tried again. "Chill." A flicker in her eyes. It was close enough. The fence took 3 hours. They spoke the entire time in this new, broken language. Hammer, water, stone, and she, in turn, gave him her words. Tu for water, tse for stone. The words themselves were not the bridge. The bridge was the effort, the exchange. The heavy, empty silence that had defined them was now filled with the sharp, clear sounds of 2 worlds touching. When they were done, the corral was mended. They stood by the water trough, and he looked at her, truly looked at her. Saiichi, she said, pointing to her own chest. It was the first time he had heard her name. He had not even thought to ask. Saiichi, he repeated. He pointed to himself. Matthew? She nodded. Matthew. She picked up the tamping rod and walked back to the cabin, her back straight. He watched her go, the name Saiichi feeling strange and solid on his tongue. The storms that followed the drought were brief but violent, washing away the topsoil and rattling the loose boards of the cabin. It was after one such windstorm that Saiichi found the locket. She was sweeping, as she did every morning, clearing the fine layer of red dust that coated everything. One of the floorboards near the hearth, one he always seemed to step over, had been worked loose by the wind and the damp. She knelt, her curiosity piqued. This was his space, the part of the cabin he inhabited, while she kept to her corner. She brushed the dust away and worked her strong fingers under the edge of the plank. It came up with a dry scraping sound. Beneath it, in the shallow, packed dirt, was a small, dark bundle wrapped in oilcloth. It was not a hiding place meant to fool anyone, just to keep something out of sight. She looked over her shoulder. He was outside, chopping at the roots of a dead mesquite. She was alone. She lifted the package. It was light. She unwrapped the stiff, cracked cloth. Inside was a metal locket, oval and plain, made of brass or tin. It was dark with tarnish, and a deep, angry scratch ran across the front, as if someone had tried to gouge it open with a knife. Her thumbnail found the catch. It was stiff, but it sprang open. Inside, protected by a thin, warped piece of glass, was a photograph, a tintype, a woman and a child. Saiichi studied it. The woman was young, with pale eyes and thin, tight lips. She was not smiling. She stared at the camera as if it were an enemy. She wore a dark, high-collared dress. In her arms, she held an infant, so tightly wrapped in white swaddling that it looked like a cocoon. Only a small, pale face was visible. This was the past he carried. This was the wife who died of fever, the child who died at birth. She heard the cabin door creak. Matthew stood there, framed against the harsh morning light. He held the axe in his hand. His gaze dropped from her face to the locket in her hands, to the open hollow in the floor. His face, usually so empty, so worn down, changed. It did not fill with anger. It emptied completely. It became a mask of hard, cold stone, the look of a man staring at a fresh grave, the look of a man who had been struck. Saiichi did not flinch. She did not look ashamed. She simply looked at him, holding the artifact of his grief. Then, very slowly, she closed the locket. The soft snap of the metal was loud in the small room. She wrapped it carefully in the oilcloth, her movements deliberate. She placed it back in the hollow. She set the floorboard back in its place, pushing it down firmly, tamping the edges with her fist until it was secure. She stood, picked up the broom, and turned her back to him, resuming her sweeping of the hearth. She did not ask. He did not explain. Matthew Bell stood in the doorway for a long, heavy minute. His knuckles were white on the handle of the axe. He watched her back, the steady, rhythmic motion of the broom. She had seen his ghosts, and she had not spoken. She had buried them again for him. He turned, without a word, and went back outside. The sound of his chopping began again, harder this time, each strike a blow against the silence. But the locket was no longer just his secret. It was now hers, too. The field of withered corn stalks was a testament to his failure. Matthew had been hacking at them, clearing the ground for a fallow season he had no faith in. Saichi came out, carrying the shovel. She watched him for a moment, then walked to the head of the field, near the shallow trough that caught the overflow from the well. She began to dig. "No," he said, walking over, "is dry, no water." She ignored him. She was not digging deep holes. She was carving a shallow, winding trench, not straight, but following the almost imperceptible contours of the land. She worked with a steady, practiced rhythm, her body moving with an intelligence the land understood. He watched, confused. She was making a snake in the dirt. She pointed to the well, then to the trench, then to the field. "Two," she said. "Water." He saw it then. She was not trying to flood the field. She was building a path, a way to guide small amounts of water, to let it soak deep rather than run off the baked surface. It was a technique of her people, who had coaxed life from the desert for centuries. He grabbed the hoe, his frustration turning to a dim, sharp hope. He began to bank the earth where she dug, packing the sides of the tiny canal with clay mud, making it hold. They worked together. This was new. It was not the silent sharing of chores in the cabin. This was a partnership. This was two bodies working in unison, with a single purpose: survival. The sun beat down. The heat was a physical weight. They were close, side by side in the dirt. He dug, she packed. She moved to clear a large stone, kneeling in the trench. He passed her the shovel, and his calloused fingers brushed the back of her hand. A jolt went through them both, sharp as static, quick as a snake bite. He pulled his hand back. She froze, her head bowed. He could smell her. It was not the smell of sweat. It was the smell of the sun on her skin, of the dust in her hair, and something else, something clean and herbal, like the sage she sometimes crushed and rubbed on her arms. She knelt to lift the heavy stone, and the leather thong binding her hair snapped. The heavy mass of black hair fell, spilling over her shoulder, down her back. Matthew stopped, the hoe halfway to the ground. He stared. He had only ever seen her with her hair bound, severe and tight. Now, it was loose, wild, and dark against the red earth. She felt his gaze. She looked up, her face streaked with sweat and dirt, her hair curtaining her face. Their eyes met. The air between them thickened, charged with the brutal heat, the shared labor, and the sudden, unspoken realization of her as a woman, and him as a man. It was a raw, physical tension, as real as the stone in her hands. His jaw tightened. He looked away first, turning his back. He swung the hoe with a sudden, violent motion, attacking the earth. Saichi rose slowly. She gathered her hair, her hands shaking slightly, and bound it back up, tying it with a strip of cloth from her skirt. They did not speak again for the rest of the day. The nights turned cold. The high desert wind had a razor's edge, and the cabin, built for heat, offered little comfort. They sat by the fire. It was their nightly ritual. He would sit on the lone chair, she on the floor in her corner. Silence. She was mending one of his shirts, her fingers working the needle with a speed and precision that fascinated him. The firelight caught the planes of her face. Her dark eyes focused on the task. A log in the hearth popped, sending a shower of sparks. The wind howled outside, finding a crack in the wall, and she shivered. It was a small, uncontrollable tremor that ran through her shoulders. Matthew stopped oiling the mule's harness. "You cold?" he asked. The two words were rough, hesitant. She looked up, surprised by his voice. She understood the word. She shook her head. "No." She would not admit weakness. He frowned. He looked at the thin, worn blanket on her pallet. It was the only one she had, the one she'd arrived with. He knew she was lying. He stood. The chair scraped on the dirt floor. He climbed the ladder to the loft. She heard him moving around. the sound of a trunk opening. He came back down, in his arms. He carried a heavy wool blanket, folded neatly. It was dark blue, thick and clean. It was the one from his own bed, the one his wife had woven. He held it out to her. Saiichi stared at the blanket. She did not move. To accept it was more than accepting warmth. It was accepting something else, a kindness, a connection. She had built her survival on rejecting both. She looked back down at her sewing. Matthew's face tightened with a familiar frustration. He was a man who knew only the language of action, and his action was being refused. He huffed, a sharp sound of impatience. He did not offer it again. He walked over and tossed the heavy blanket onto her pallet. It landed with a soft, solid weight. "It's cold," he said, his voice firm, almost an order. He pointed at the blanket, then at her. "You!" He did not wait for an answer. He turned, climbed the ladder, and disappeared into the loft. She sat for a long time, the shirt forgotten in her lap. The fire burned low, and the room grew colder. Finally, she stood and walked to her corner. She touched the wool. It was heavy, and it held the faint, clean smell of him, of wood smoke and dry grass. And man, she unfolded it, wrapped it around her shoulders, and sat down. The warmth was immediate, sinking into her bones. She wrapped it tighter, and for the first time since the soldiers had come, she felt something other than cold. The rain came just after midnight, a sudden, violent assault. It was not the gentle soaking the new trenches needed, but a deluge, a roar that hammered the sod roof. Matthew woke instantly. Sitting up in the dark, the sound was too hard. A moment later, a stream of muddy water poured from a weak spot in the roof, hissing as it hit the last embers of the fire, plunging the room into absolute blackness. "Damn it!" he yelled, his voice lost in the thunder. "Damn it all." He scrambled down the ladder, his bare feet landing in an inch of cold water. The floor was already flooding. Saiichi was already moving. He could see her silhouette against the dim gray of the window, a shadow hauling his sack of flour and the bean stores to the driest spot. Up on the table. Another leak sprang, then another. The roof was giving way. "The roof!" he shouted over the din, pointing up. "It will fall!" He shoved the table, sending the flour sack tumbling. "Help!" he grunted, pushing it toward the center of the room where the main beam was visibly sagging. She understood. They manhandled the heavy table into place under the beam. He climbed on top, the wood slick with mud, and braced his shoulders against the sagging log, pushing up with all his strength. The log groaned. Water and sod rained down on him. "A post!" he grunted, the strain turning his voice into a gasp. "Wood! Outside! Get wood!" She did not understand the words, but she saw what he was doing. She saw the beam bending. She knew he needed a brace. She yanked the cabin door open and ran out into the blinding, freezing storm. The wind tore at her, and the rain felt like needles. She found the pile of spare fence posts near the corral, half submerged in mud. She seized one, her fingers sinking into the wet, rough wood, and dragged it back, her feet sliding in the muck. She stumbled back inside, hauling the heavy post. The cabin was a sea of mud. Matthew was still on the table, his arms trembling, his face a mask of strain. "Here," he gasped. "Push! Under! Here!" She climbed onto the table with him. Her bare feet slipped. She grabbed his arm to steady herself, and they both nearly fell. "Shove it!" he roared. She lifted the heavy post, wedging one end against the tabletop and the other under the sagging beam. She pushed with all her might. As she put her full weight into it, her foot shot out from under her on the slick, muddy surface. A short, sharp cry was torn from her throat. She fell backward. He reacted without thought. He let go of the beam. He dropped his arms and caught her. His right arm snapped around her waist. His left grabbed her shoulder. He pulled her against him. her back to his chest, trapping her body against his to stop her fall. They stood there, frozen, on the swaying table. The cabin was chaos. The rain hammered, the roof groaned, but the brace held, and he held her. She was pressed tight against his body. He was solid, warm, and trembling with effort. She could feel his heart hammering against her back. Her wet hair was plastered to her face, and her hands were gripping his forearms. He could feel the solid, strong shape of her, the tense muscles in her back, her hip pressed against his stomach. The sound of the storm faded. There was only the sound of their breathing, harsh and ragged in the dark. He was holding an Apache woman. She was being held by a white farmer. She tilted her head back, looking up at him. Her eyes were wide and dark in the gloom. He looked down. He saw her mouth, parted, her quick, shallow breaths. He saw the water running down her throat, a raw, sudden hunger, sharper than any cold, shot through him. It was a terrifying, unwelcome thing. She saw the look in his eyes. She saw the hunger, and she saw the shock that followed it. She broke the spell. She pushed against his chest, breaking his grip. She scrambled off the table, landing in the ankle-deep mud. He dropped his arms as if she had burned him. He stayed on the table for a moment, his hands clenched, his chest heaving. Then he climbed down, his movements stiff. The post was holding. The leak had slowed to a few steady drips. They stood on opposite sides of the ruined room, soaked to the skin, shivering. The storm raged outside, but the one that had just passed between them was far more dangerous. He turned his back to her, staring at the leaking wall, his jaw set. She retreated to her corner, picked up her sopping wet blanket, and wrapped it around herself, her teeth chattering. They did not speak for the rest of the night. A few evenings later, the world was quiet again. The storm had passed, leaving the air clear and cold. Matthew came in from repairing the corral, the mud caked on his boots, his hands raw. The cabin was warm. Saichi had a fire going. He stopped just inside the door. She had dragged the small wooden tub, the one he used for Jed's feed, in front of the hearth. It was filled with steaming water, heated in the kettle. She was sitting on the floor, her back to him, her skirt hiked up to her knees. She placed one foot into the tub of hot water. A small hiss of breath escaped her. Matthew did not move. He stood in the shadows by the door and watched. Her movements were slow, unhurried. They were ritualistic. She took a small piece of lye soap and washed her foot, her hands moving over her ankle, her arch, between her toes. Her skin, in the firelight, looked like polished copper. Her legs were strong, the muscles defined. Her feet were slender but tough, scarred from a lifetime of walking on hard earth. It was a simple, private act, but it felt sacred. He watched the firelight play on the water, on her skin, on the delicate, strong turn of her ankle. She stopped. She knew he was there. She could feel his gaze on her, as heavy as a hand. Slowly, she turned her head and looked at him over her shoulder. Her gaze was direct. It was not challenging. It was not an invitation. It was not shy. It was a simple, profound statement. I see you looking. She did not flinch. She did not cover herself. Matthew felt a hot flush move up his neck. He felt like an intruder, a spy, but he did not look away. He held her gaze. In that moment, he was not the farmer and she the outcast. They were just a man and a woman, in a small room in the middle of nowhere. After a long, silent moment, she turned back to the water. She lifted her other foot and submerged it, continuing her task as if he were not there. Matthew moved stiffly to the table and sat down. He began to scrape the mud from his boots, but his hands were unsteady. The line of privacy had been crossed, and she had not built a wall. The tension in the cabin grew, day by day, until it was a living thing, a knife's edge. He brushed against her by the hearth, and they both jumped back, their nerves raw. He watched her grind corn, the steady, rhythmic rocking of her hips, and he had to clench his fists and force himself to go outside, into the cold air. One evening, the silence was heavier than he could bear. He sat on his chair, staring into the fire, his mind lost. He was seeing the locket, the pale face of his wife, the tiny, still bundle. The grief was on him, a physical weight. Saichi watched him from her corner. She saw the hollowness in his eyes, the deep lines of sorrow etched around his mouth. This was not the anger of the trader, or the frustration of the farmer. This was the grief of a man who had lost everything. It was a grief she knew. It was the same as her own. She rose, her movements silent. She did not go to her pallet. She sat on the floor, near him, but not touching. He did not look at her. He seemed lost, miles away. She looked at his hand, resting on his knee. It was a hard hand, split and calloused, but it was trembling. She looked at his chest, the slow, sad rise and fall of it. Slowly, as if testing the thin ice on a pond, she lifted her own hand. She hesitated, then placed her palm flat against his chest, over his heart. He went rigid. His breath stopped. Her hand was warm. He could feel the steady, living warmth of it, right through the coarse wool of his shirt. It was a simple, profound gesture. Comfort. It was the first time she had ever touched him with kindness. He closed his eyes. A long, shuddering breath escaped him. He covered her hand with his own. His grip was crushingly tight, his calloused palm scraping her skin. He held her hand pressed flat to his chest, as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling apart. They sat like that for a long, aching minute. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind. This was the brink. He knew it. She knew it. One wrong move, one shift, and they would both fall into something neither was ready for. He pulled her hand away from his chest. He held it, turning it over, looking at her palm in the firelight, the lines etched by hardship. His thumb traced the scar on her wrist. Then, slowly, he let it go. He dropped her hand as if it were a hot coal. He stood up so abruptly the chair nearly fell. He did not look at her. He climbed the ladder to the loft, his movement stiff and clumsy, and disappeared. She stayed by the fire, her hand open on her lap, tingling where he had held it. The desire was in the room now, heavy and thick as smoke, but the wall of their restraint, built of grief and shame and fear, still held. A wagon rattled into the yard 2 days later. It was the first visitor since she had arrived. Matthew went to the door, his face settling into its usual guarded mask. Saichi watched from the shadow of the window. It was a trader, a man with a greasy coat and small, mean eyes. His wagon was loaded with barrels and sacks. "Bell," the trader called out, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Heard you was still alive out here, barely, from the looks of this place." "What do you want, Silas?" Matthew said. His voice was flat. He needed powder and salt, and he hated this man. "Just making my rounds," Silas Croft said, his eyes scanning the property, lingering on the mended corral. "Heard you got yourself company." His gaze slid to the cabin, where Saichi was a shadow. Matthew stepped sideways, blocking the man's view. "I need 2 pounds of powder and a sack of salt." "In a hurry?" Silas laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Not one for being neighborly. Are you Bell? Not going to introduce me to the new help?" "My business," Matthew said, his voice dropping. "Oh, it's everyone's business. Friend," Silas said, leaning against his wagon with a knowing, leering grin. "Word travels. Word is the Apache Council got tired of one of their women, and you got the leavings." Matthew went still. "The punishment bride," Silas continued, enjoying himself. "That's what they're calling her in town. Heard she was given to you 'cause you're too poor to buy a proper wife, and too broken to find one." Inside the cabin, Saichi heard the words, "punishment bride." She understood. Her face became stone. "She wild Belle?" Silas leered, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I hear they're just like animals when you get 'em broke. Bet she... What's the price?" "Belle, I got a full barrel of good whiskey. I'll trade you for an hour with her. Save you the trouble of taming her yourself." Matthew Bell did not speak. He did not raise his voice. He did not issue a warning. He moved. He crossed the 2 yards between them in a single, blurring step and hit Silas Croft in the face. It was not a brawler's punch. It was a farmer's punch, short and brutal, backed by 2 years of grief and 8 months of drought and a lifetime of silent, burning rage. The sound was a wet, heavy crack. Silas dropped like a sack of grain, sprawling in the dust, his nose a red ruin. He sputtered, blood and tobacco juice flying, his eyes wide with shock. Matthew stood over him. His chest was heaving. His pale, empty eyes were gone. In their place were 2 burning coals, full of a cold, killing fury. "You get on your wagon," Matthew said. His voice was not a yell. It was a low, dangerous rasp that cut through the still air. "You don't ever come back here. You don't ever speak her name." "Damn! Belle!" Silas whimpered, scrambling backward like a crab, holding his bleeding face. Just talk. A joke." "Get out!" Matthew roared, the word tearing from his throat. Silas scrambled onto his wagon, grabbed his whip, and lashed his mules. The wagon tore out of the yard, disappearing in a cloud of dust and curses. Matthew stood there for a long time, his back to the cabin, breathing hard. His right hand was shaking, his knuckles split and bloody. The cabin door opened. Saichi stepped out onto the porch. She did not go to him. She just stood there, watching him. She had seen this man's grief. She had seen his exhaustion. She had seen his restraint. Now, she saw his fury, and she knew, with a sudden, sharp clarity that stole her breath, that it was not for his dead wife, it was not for his failed crop. It was for her. He turned, his face still dark with anger. He saw her looking at him, at his bloody hand. He said nothing. He stalked past her into the cabin, grabbed the water bucket, and plunged his hand into it. He began to scrub the blood away, his back rigid. She watched him, and something deep inside her, something that had been frozen solid for a season, cracked. The punch changed the air. It hung in the cabin, a sharp, metallic taste in the silence that followed. Matthew's split knuckles healed, but the fury he had shown for her sake remained. A new line drawn in the dust. He had defended her. He had called her nothing. He had just hit a man for speaking her name. And the land, as if sensing the shift, responded. The thin, snaking trenches Saichi had dug were working. The brief, violent rain had not washed the earth away. The clay-packed gullies had held, guiding the water, letting it sink deep into the baked ground. Where Matthew had seen only failure, Saichi had planted in the small, irrigated patches. She had dropped the last of his bean supply and the squash seeds she had carried in her own small pouch. One morning, 2 weeks after the fight, he came from the well and stopped. There, against the red earth, was a line of green. It was not the pale, sickly yellow of his previous crops. This was a deep, vibrant green. Small, determined leaves, 2 by 2, were pushing up from the mud. He walked over, his boots silent in the soft dirt. He knelt, touching a leaf. It was real. It was alive. Saichi was at the end of the row, her hands dark with mud, packing the bank of a trench. She looked up, watching him. "Green," he said. The word sounded rusty. "Dine," she said. She touched the ground. "It lives." He looked at her mud-caked hands, at the sweat on her brow. She had not just cleaned his house. She was saving his land. She was saving him. He had been trying to force the land to bend to his will. She was listening to it, asking it. He picked up the hoe. I get more water, he said. He worked the well, pulling the bucket up, his shoulders straining. He poured the precious, sloshing water into the head of her trench, and they watched as it made its slow, dark path down the line, feeding the new life. They worked all day, side by side, the silence no longer a wall, but a shared space, a shared hope. Saichi was foraging a few days later, miles from the cabin in a rocky arroyo. When she found the hawk, it was a large red tail, a mature bird, but it was grounded. It lay in the shadow of a boulder, its feathers ruffled, its dark eyes bright with pain and fury. When she drew closer, it tried to fly, but only one wing beat the air. The other hung limp, bent at an ugly, unnatural angle. It shrieked, a high, tearing sound, and snapped its beak at her. She saw the wound. It had been shot. The small, dark hole in its side was crusted with blood. She was Apache. A hawk was a messenger, a sacred thing. But this was also a predator, a competitor for the rabbits she snared. She looked at its brokenness, its defiance. It was a mirror. She spent an hour tracking it. It hopped and dragged itself, hiding in the brush. But it was weak, finally. She cornered it against a rock face. She took her blanket, and with a single, swift motion, she threw it over the bird, enveloping it, muffling its talons and its shrieks. She carried the bundled fighting weight back to the cabin. Matthew was splitting wood when he saw her coming, carrying the lumpy, struggling blanket. "What is it?" he asked. She laid the bundle down and pulled back the wool. The hawk exploded in a fury of feathers and claws, shrieking, its one good wing beating. Matthew jumped back. "Damn," he said. "A chicken hawk. Kill it. It'll steal what little we have." Saichi shook her head. "Is hurt. It's dying. Saichi, leave it. It is the way." "No," she said. Her voice was flat. An order. She went into the cabin. He watched, perplexed, as she came back with a strip of leather, one of his splints of kindling wood, and her pouch of herbs. He stood, arms crossed, and watched. He expected her to be torn apart. But her movements were not what he expected. They were not wild. They were slow, deliberate, and calm. She spoke to the bird, low sounds in her own tongue, a soft, crooning murmur. The bird watched her, its head cocked, its eyes still full of fire. But the shrieking stopped. She laid a hand on its back, a firm, gentle pressure. She examined the wing, her fingers probing. The hawk tensed, but it did not strike. "It's broken," she said. She showed him the angle. She took the two straight sticks and laid them along the bone. With a quick, strong motion, she pulled the bone straight. The bird cried out, a sharp, terrible sound, and snapped, but she did not flinch. She bound the wing to the splint with the leather thong, tight and secure. Then she tended the gunshot wound. She cleaned it with water from the bucket. She took herbs from her pouch, chewed them into a dark paste, and packed the small hole. Matthew stood in silence. He had seen men in saloons set a bone, full of whiskey and loud curses. He had never seen this quiet, this gentleness. It was a patience he could not comprehend. She made a small cage of old slats, and for 2 weeks, the hawk lived by the hearth. Saichi fed it water from her own cup. She snared a rabbit just for the bird, tearing the meat into small pieces and feeding it by hand. The hawk, which should have been a screaming, violent thing, grew calm under her care. It would watch her move about the cabin, its dark eyes tracking her. Matthew watched her. He watched her gentle hands, the same hands that patched his coat and scrubbed his floor, now tending this broken creature. He thought of the word Silas Croft had used, punishment. He thought of what his own people said about hers. Savage? He looked at her, kneeling by the fire, whispering to the bird in Apache, and he saw a lie. The whole world was a lie. This was not a savage. This was not a punishment. This was the only thing in his life that made any sense. On the 15th day, she took the splint off. The wing was straight. The wound was a clean scar. She carried the bird outside. Matthew followed, wiping his hands on his trousers. She held the hawk on her forearm, the leather thong loose. "Go," she said. "Sky." The hawk tested its wing, a short, strong flap. It looked at her, then at the vast, blue emptiness above. With a powerful thrust, it launched from her arm, caught the wind, and soared. It circled the cabin once, a high, perfect arc, and then, with a single, shrill cry, it flew east, toward the mountains. Free. Saichi watched it until it was a speck, her face unreadable. Matthew stood beside her. You saved it. It is free," she said, almost to herself. She turned and went back inside, leaving him alone under the empty sky. That night, the hawk's release seemed to have unbound something else. The cabin felt small, the air thick with things unsaid. They sat by the fire. He was oiling the rifle. She was mending a tear in the flour sack. Her name was Sarah, he said. His voice was so low, she almost did not hear it. She looked up. He was not looking at her. He was staring at the floorboard, the one she had lifted. "The locket," he said, as if the word itself pained him. "My wife, Sarah." Saichi put the sack down. She waited. She was from back east. She hated this land. She hated the dust. She said it was a godless place. He stopped, his hand still on the rifle. She was right. He took a long, ragged breath. "We had a son. He was born, silent, never made a sound. I made the box myself, buried him before the sun set. That was 6 years ago." Sachika's eyes never left his face. She saw the old, raw grief, the wound he had kept covered. "Sarah, she broke. After that, she was not right. She sat in that chair, your chair." He pointed to the one she was not sitting in. "She just rocked. She did not talk. Then the fever came," he whispered. "It was last year. No, 2 years. I lose track." He passed a hand over his face. "She burned for 3 days. She did not know me. She just begged. She begged for water. And the well was low. Like now." He looked at Saichi then. His eyes haunted, a terrible clarity in them. "She died, begging for water, and I gave her the last of it. I held the cup to her lips, and she could not swallow. She died with the water on her chin, and I sat here, with her for 2 days, until I had to." He stopped. The cabin was filled with the terrible, heavy weight of his confession. He had not told this to another living soul. "I buried her up on the hill, next to the boy," he said, his voice flat. "I buried everything." Saichi watched him. She felt the chill of his words, the ice of his loneliness. It was a cold she knew well. She did not touch him. She just nodded. "Once." "I see," she said. The next night, the roles were reversed. He sat on the chair. She sat on the floor, her hands idle. My people," she began, her voice low. Her broken English was halting, each word costing her. "They say I am bad." Matthew watched her. He saw her brace herself, just as he had. "A soldier, he had blue coat, blue eyes." She looked at Matthew's pale, gray eyes. "He said, 'Peace.' He said, 'No more fight.' He said, 'Your people, my people, one.'" She looked down at her hands. "He was kind. He bring sugar. He laugh. I was a fool, a girl." "What did he do?" Matthew asked, his voice a low growl. "He promise me a home, with him. He asked, "Where is the spring, the hidden spring, where my people drink when the rivers are gone?" She met his gaze, and her eyes were black with shame. "I show him. I trust. I show him the path. I think. I bring peace. I think. I am a bridge." "He lied," Matthew said. It was not a question. "He lie," she whispered. "He bring soldiers, many. They take the spring. They kill my uncle, my cousin." Her voice broke. "Just for a second. They take children, gone." "And him?" "He was gone. He ride away. He not look back. He get honor for finding the water." "And you," Matthew said, his voice raw. "I go back, alone. My people, they see me. They see the shame. They see the dead. They say I am, oh yeah, ghost, betrayal. They say I am white, inside. They cast me out." She took a long, shuddering breath. The judgment, they say, I am punishment. They give me to you to show me my place, to show me I am nothing, not Apache, not white. I am nothing. He looked at her, this woman who had survived judgment, exile, and wolves. This woman who had healed a hawk and was coaxing life from his dead land. "You are not nothing," he said. The heat was a living thing, a heavy, damp blanket that suffocated the cabin. It was the kind of night that bred madness. Matthew lay in his loft, sweating on his bare cot, the air too thick to breathe. He had not slept. He was thinking of her words. "I am nothing." He heard it then, a small sound, below, a hitching, catching breath. He went still. He heard it again, a whimper, choked back, a soft, muffled sound, like an animal in a trap. He sat up. The loft boards creaked. The sound stopped, as if she was holding her breath. He heard her move, a rustle on the pallet, then the sound again, a quiet, desperate sob that she was trying to swallow. A nightmare. The confessions had brought the ghosts out of their graves. He stood, his bare feet on the rough wood, and climbed down the ladder. The cabin was lit by a pale, sick-looking moon. He could see her on her pallet. She was curled in a tight ball, her knees to her chest, her back to him. Her shoulders were shaking. He walked over. He knelt beside her. "Saichi," he whispered. She flinched violently, a gasp tearing from her. She scrambled away from him, crab-walking backward until she hit the wall, her eyes wide with terror, her hands up, as if to ward off a blow. In the gloom, he was not Matthew. He was the soldier. He was the elders. He was the judgment. "No," he said, his voice gentle. He held up his hands, palms open. "Is me, Matthew, is safe." She stared at him, her chest heaving. The terror in her eyes slowly faded, replaced by a dazed, raw-boned confusion. She was still in the dream. "Matthew," she whispered, testing the name. "Is a dream," he said, the words feeling clumsy. "A bad dream. You cry." She touched her face. Her cheeks were wet. The realization hit her, and with it, a wave of shame. She bowed her head, hiding her face in her hands. The sobs came again, no longer quiet, but dry, racking shudders that shook her whole body. He did not know what to do. He was a man built of sharp edges and hard surfaces. He had no softness to offer. He did what he had not done since Sarah died. He acted. He sat on the floor beside her. He reached out and touched her shoulder. She was trembling like a leaf. He slid closer, his back against the cabin wall, and pulled her against him. He did not ask. He just did it. He pulled her sideways, into his lap, his arm wrapping around her back, pulling her head against his chest. She was stiff as a board for a moment, her body resisting. Then, something inside her broke. She turned, burying her face in the rough wool of his undershirt, and she clung to him. Her hands gripped his arms, her nails digging in, and she wept. She wept for the soldier, for her people, for the lost children, for the hawk, for the shame of being a punishment. It all came out, a hot, silent flood against his chest. And Matthew just held her. He did not speak. He did not pat her back. He just held on, his hand flat on her back, anchoring her. He was a rock in the middle of her flood, and he did not move. He held her for a long time. The sobs lessened, the shaking eased, the dry, racking breaths softened, becoming just breathing. She was quiet. She was listening to his heart, a slow, steady, solid beat under her ear. It was the most real thing she had ever known. She pulled back, just enough to look at him. Her face was a mess of tears and dirt, her hair wild around her face. The moonlight caught the wet tracks on her cheeks. He looked down at her. He saw her pain. He saw her strength. He saw her. It was not passion. It was not hunger. It was something far deeper. It was loneliness. It was two people at the bottom of the world, with no one else to hold on to. She lifted a hand, her fingers still trembling. She touched his face. Her palm was cool against his hot, bearded skin. Her fingers were calloused, but her touch was impossibly soft. She traced the line of his jaw. She put her thumb on his bottom lip. It was a question. It was comfort. It was forgiveness. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closed. A breath he had been holding for 2 years escaped him. Her face was inches from his. He could feel her breath on his mouth. He leaned in. She met him halfway. The kiss was not what he thought it would be. It was not the desperate, fiery kiss of a man starved. It was slow. It was chaste. It was salt and dust and tears. It was the simple, devastating pressure of her mouth against his. It was a shared breath. It was comfort. It lasted only a moment. He pulled away. The reality of it hit him. He was in his cabin, on the floor, kissing an Apache woman who had been crying. He was her keeper. He was taking advantage. I am sorry, he rasped, his voice thick. I should not. You are. He tried to pull away. She did not let him go. Her hand, which had been on his face, moved to the back of his neck. Her fingers threaded into his hair. Her grip was not hard, but it was absolute. No, she whispered. Don't. Sorry, stay. It was not a plea. It was a statement. Stay. He looked into her eyes. There was no fear there now. No shame. Only a deep, profound, and terrible need that matched his own. He did not go back to the loft. He was still on the floor, and she was still in his arms. He shifted, easing them both down onto her pallet. He did not cover them with his blanket. He just lay with her. He lay on his back, his arm still around her. She curled against his side, her head on his shoulder, her hand flat on his chest, right over his heart. They were not lovers. Not yet. They were two wounded humans, two ghosts, finally craving warmth. They lay in the dark, fully clothed, listening to the crickets and the sound of each other's breathing. And for the first time in years, Matthew Bell slept. He slept deeply, without dreams, grounded by the solid, living weight of the woman beside him. He woke to the smell of smoke. He shot up, disoriented. The light in the cabin was gray. He was on the floor. He was alone on the pallet. He saw her. She was at the hearth, her back to him, tending the fire. The awkwardness of the morning, of what had passed, seized him. He had slept in her bed. He had held her. He had kissed her. He scrambled to his feet, his muscles stiff. I will see to Jed," he mumbled, his voice rough with sleep. He grabbed his boots and fled the cabin, not looking at her. He stood outside, breathing in the cool morning air. He felt different. He felt rested. He felt light. The constant crushing weight on his chest had eased. He fed the mule, his hands working mechanically. He was terrified to go back in. What would they say? How could they go back to what they were? He forced himself. He walked back to the cabin, his shoulders set. He stopped in the doorway. The smell was not just smoke. It was spice. It was roasted. It was good. She was not making his bland bean soup. She was not making his hard, dry corn cakes. She had ground her own herbs. She had found a patch of wild onions. She had one of the rabbits they had snared, spitted over the fire, seasoned with things he did not know. She had made a thin, hot bread from his cornmeal, but she had mixed something into it, something that made it yellow and fragrant. She heard him. She turned, holding 2 wooden bowls. She did not look shy. She did not look ashamed. Her face was calm, her eyes clear. She held one of the bowls out to him. He took it. He looked inside. It was a thick, rich stew, dark with herbs and meat. He tasted it. It was not just hot. It was alive. It was full of flavor. It was sharp and earthy, and it warmed him from the inside out. He looked at her, his mouth full, his eyes wide with surprise. She was watching him, a small, tentative question in her eyes. He swallowed. He looked at the stew. He looked at her, standing in the morning light, her hair unbound, her chin high. A strange, stiff, cracking feeling happened to his face. It was a feeling he had not known for years. His mouth, usually set in a hard, grim line, pulled up at the corners. He smiled. It was not a grimace. It was not a half-hearted twitch. It was a real smile, one that reached his pale, tired eyes and lit them from within. Saichi saw it. She saw the man he was under the grief. Her own face softened. She did not smile back, but she held his gaze. The wall was gone. They were in the same room. They were home. The smile he had given her, the one that broke the dry earth of his face, settled. It stayed. He ate the food she made, and for the first time, it was not just fuel. It was a shared meal. The cabin, once a box of silence, was now filled with new, small sounds. The scrape of her spoon in the pot, the way he cleared his throat, not in irritation, but in simple presence. They had slept in the same bed, on her pallet, but only as 2 bodies seeking warmth from a nightmare. He had returned to his loft. The kiss had been a moment of comfort, but now, the smile, the food, the shared memory of his fury against Silas. It had changed the space between them. They were no longer master and punishment. They were not even man and woman. They were just Matthew and Saichi, 2 people on a failing piece of land, breathing the same dry air. The new life in the fields mirrored the new life in the cabin. The bean plants were strong, the squash vines beginning to crawl, thick and green, along her clay trenches. They worked the rows together, side by side, he with the hoe, breaking the stubborn clumps of earth, she with her hands, banking the trenches, pulling the few weeds that dared to grow. Their hands brushed as they passed a water bucket. Neither pulled away. It was a hot, still afternoon, the air heavy and yellow with dust, when he heard the horses. It was not one rider. Like Silas, it was a group, 4, maybe 5, coming hard. Matthew's head snapped up. His face, which had softened in the past weeks, went flat and cold. He dropped the hoe. "Inside," he said. The word was a knife. Saichi saw the dust cloud. She saw his face. She did not ask. She ran to the cabin. "Stay," he said, pointing to her corner. away from the window. Do not make sound. He grabbed the rifle from its pegs above the door. He checked the load. His movements economical. Sure. He stepped outside onto the small, broken porch and stood, the rifle held loose, its barrel pointing at the ground. 4 men rode into his yard. They were not traders. They were not farmers. They were hard men with dust-caked coats and rifles in their saddle scabbards. The man in the lead was broad, with a sun-scorched face and a tin star pinned to his vest. His name was Harlan. He ran the county, or what passed for it. Harlan pulled his horse up, his eyes sweeping the property. He saw the mule, the patched corral, the green, irrigated lines of the garden. His gaze lingered on the green. "Bell," Harlan said. His voice was like grinding stones. "Harlan," Matthew replied. He did not move. "Getting green," Harlan noted, spitting into the dust. "Heard your crop died." "It rained," Matthew said. "That ain't all I heard." Harlan leaned forward on his saddle horn. His 3 men fanned out, their hands resting near their hips. "I heard you got something that don't belong to you, Matthew." Matthew waited. The sun beat on his head. "Heard you're harboring an Indian, an Apache woman." "Inside." Saichi went rigid. She heard the words. She stopped breathing. "I had one," Matthew said, his voice as flat as the desert. "She was given to me by her tribe, back in the spring." "Yeah, that's the one," Harlan said, nodding. "The punishment bride. Well, her punishment ain't over. We got a writ for her. Seems she ain't just an outcast. She's a criminal." "A criminal," Matthew repeated. "That's right. Aided the Chiricahua uprising 2 years back. Showed 'em paths. Got soldiers killed." Harlan squinted. "There's a bounty. $500. Territorial bounty." So, Saichi's confession was true, and Silas had spread the word. "We're here to collect her. Bell, send her out." Matthew looked at Harlan. He looked at the 3 men, their mean, expectant faces. He thought of her, healing the hawk. He thought of her, weeping in his arms. He thought of her smile when he ate her food. "Can't," Matthew said. Harlan's hand moved, just an inch, closer to his pistol. "Can't or won't?" "Can't," Matthew said. "She's dead." The silence in the yard was absolute. Even the mule stopped swishing its tail. Harlan's eyes narrowed. "Dead." "Fever," Matthew said. "Came on fast, burned her up in 2 days, just like my wife." "When?" "3 weeks ago, maybe 4. Time blurs out here." "Where's the grave?" one of the other men, a thin one with a scar, asked. Matthew nodded his head toward the hill behind the cabin. "Up there, under the mesquite, next to the other 2. I find that mighty convenient." "Bell," Harlan said. "A $500 bounty just dies of fever right after Silas Croft comes visitin'." "I don't care what you find," Matthew said, his voice dropping. "She's in the ground. You want to see? You get a shovel. You dig. You'll find what's left. But you ain't touchin' my wife's grave or my son's." He let his hand rest on the stock of his rifle. It was not a threat. It was a fact. Harlan stared at him. He saw the look in Matthew's eyes. It was not the look of a liar. It was the look of a man who had buried everything he had. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose, and would kill to protect the dust of his dead. It was the truest lie Matthew had ever told. "He's tellin' it straight. Harlan," the 3rd man muttered. "Look at him. He's halfway in the grave himself." Harlan kept his eyes on Matthew. He was suspicious. The green garden, it looked tended, but the man looked empty. "If we find out you're lyin', Bell," Harlan said. "I'll be right here," Matthew said. Harlan gathered his reins. his face dark. "Ride out, boys." He wheeled his horse, his eyes raking the cabin one last time. He looked at the hide-covered window, as if he could see through it. They rode out, their horses kicking up dust. Matthew did not move. He stood on the porch, his rifle in his hand, until their dust cloud was a faint haze on the horizon. He stood for another 10 minutes after that. Then he turned and went inside. Saichi was in the corner, exactly as he had left her, pressed against the wall. She was pale, her body rigid with terror. He did not speak. He leaned the rifle against the wall. He went to the hearth, picked up the shovel, and walked to the far side of the room, near her pallet. He found the loose edge of a floorboard. He worked it free with the shovel blade and pulled it up. He began to dig. The sound of the shovel biting into the hard, packed dirt of the cabin floor filled the room. He was not digging a grave. He was digging a hole, a small, dark space, just big enough for one person. Saichi watched him, her terror replaced by a dawning, terrible understanding. "Matthew," she whispered. He did not stop. The dirt piled up beside the hole. "Matthew, no." He kept digging. His shirt was dark with sweat. His movements were rhythmic, furious. She scrambled across the floor. She put her hand on his arm. "Stop, Matthew!" He stopped. He looked at her. His face was grim, his eyes hard. "They come back," she said, her broken English desperate. "They know you lie. They hurt you. They kill you." "They not find you," he grunted, gesturing to the hole. "You hide." "No," she said, shaking her head, her black hair flying. "No, I not hide. I not harm. You lie. For me, you hit Silas. For me, no, I go." "Go where?" he said, his voice rough. "To the wolves? To them?" He jabbed his thumb toward the door. "You stay here." "No," she begged, tears welling in her eyes. It was not for herself. It was for him. He was a good man. He was her man. She had brought this death to his door. "I am punishment. My people. Right. I am. Curse. I go to mountains. You safe. Please." He grabbed her arm. Not gently. His fingers dug in. "You are not curse." His voice was a low, shaking roar. "You are not punishment." He let go of her arm and jabbed his own chest. "I was dead. I was dust like the land." He pointed to the fields. "You make green. You." He pointed at his own heart. "You make live." "I will not let them take you," he said. "I will not bury another. You stay." "They will kill you," she wept. "Let them," he said. He turned and drove the shovel back into the earth. She watched him, her heart breaking. He would die for her. This broken, silent farmer, this widower, would die for the Apache woman who had been sent to curse him. He would not let her go, and she could not leave him. That night, the hiding place was a dark, shallow trench in the floor. The cabin was suffocating. The threat was outside, a living thing, circling them like the wolves. The unspoken desire, the thing they had held at bay, was inside, trapped with them. They didn't eat. He sat on the chair, cleaning his rifle. Again. His movements were short, angry. She sat on her pallet, staring at the new raw earth he had piled beside it. He was going to die. He was going to die because of her. She could not bear it. She stood up. He did not look, but his hands stopped moving on the rifle. She walked to him. She knelt at his feet, in the dirt. "Matthew," she whispered. He looked down at her. His face was a mask of grief and fury. She took the rifle from his hands. She set it on the floor. She took his hands, the one split from hitting Silas, the one caked with dirt from digging. They were hard, scarred hands. She raised them, and she placed them on her own shoulders. It was an invitation. It was a surrender. He looked at her, his breathing ragged. He saw her eyes. They were not afraid. They were not begging. They were open. She was giving him the only thing she had left, herself. "Saichi," he breathed. "I am here," she whispered. "I not leave." He leaned forward, pulling her up from her knees, his hands moving from her shoulders, one to her back, one to her hair, tangling in the thick, black mass. He pulled her against him, and his mouth found hers. It was not the chaste, comforting kiss of the nightmare. This was a kiss of desperation. It was a kiss of fear and anger and a deep, aching loneliness that had finally found its end. It was raw, and it was real. It was the taste of dust and salt and the iron of his own blood. It was not conquest. He was not taking, she was not giving. They were merging. They were two halves of a broken thing, crashing together in the dark. He lifted her, his arms shaking, and carried her the few steps from the chair to her pallet. He did not go to his loft. He lay her down, and he followed, covering her body with his own. The world was burning down outside, and they were in the center of the fire. He was rough, clumsy, a man who had forgotten what this was. But she was not delicate. She was strong. She met his hunger with her own. It was a claiming. He was claiming her from the posse, from her past, from the elders who had cast her out. And she was claiming him. She was claiming him from his grief, from his dead wife, from the dust he had been ready to join. Their clothes were torn away. Their skin met. It was a shock, like cold water. The feel of her, warm and solid and real beneath him. The feel of him, his weight, his strength, his scarred, hard body. It was a slow, aching, desperate joining. It was a fight against death. It was the most alive either of them had ever been. In the dark, long after, they lay tangled, their bodies damp, the sound of their breathing filling the small, dark room. The hiding place was a shadow beside them. She was pressed against his side, her head on his chest, her hand over his heart, just as it had been after the nightmare. But now, they were bare. There was nothing between them. "I have nothing," she whispered into his skin. "I am outcast. I have no people, no home, nothing to give you." He held her tighter, his arm a steel band. He kissed the top of her head. "You are wrong," he said, his voice thick, breaking. "You gave me everything. You gave me. I was gone. You gave me everything." The next morning, the sun rose. It was a simple, brutal fact. The world had not ended. Matthew woke first. He woke with her arm across his chest, her leg thrown over his. He had not slept in his loft. He had not slept alone. He looked at her face soft in the morning light, her black hair spread across his shoulder. His. The word was not a question. It was a statement. Mine. He did not flee. He did not feel shame. He felt solid, grounded. She woke, her eyes fluttering open, and she saw him watching her. She did not look away. She did not cover herself. She simply looked back. He leaned down and kissed her. It was a soft kiss, a morning kiss, a kiss of possession, a kiss of belonging. The shift was complete. They did not avoid each other that day. They did not speak of the night. They did not need to. They moved as one. They went to the field. He carried the rifle with him, leaning it against the fence post, where he could reach it. They worked, but now, when their hands brushed, he caught her fingers and held them for a moment. When she bent to pull a weed, he put his hand on her back, a simple, steadying touch. A stranger did pass, a lone prospector, his mule loaded with picks and pans, following the dry creek bed. He looked lost. He saw them, the white man and the Apache woman, working the green rows. He stopped. "Afternoon," he called, his voice wary. Matthew turned. Saichi stood beside him. Matthew put his arm around her waist, pulling her to his side. It was a simple, declarative act. "Afternoon," Matthew called back. This the Bell place?" the prospector asked. "It is," Matthew said. The prospector's eyes lingered on Saichi, on Matthew's arm around her. "Just checking my way," the man mumbled. He saw Matthew's hand, resting near the rifle. He saw the way the man held the woman. He tipped his hat. My wife is waiting on me." "Best be on your way, then," Matthew said. The man hurried on. Saichi looked up at Matthew. He had not called her his wife. He had not needed to. He had called her his... But the world was closing in. 2 days later, another rider, not Harlan, this was Eli, their nearest neighbor, who lived 10 miles east, a nervous man with a kind wife who had known Sarah. He rode in, his face gray with worry. "Matthew," he said, not even dismounting. He was in a hurry. I come to warn you." "Eli," Matthew said, walking over. Saichi stood on the porch, watching. "It's talk, in town. That traitor, Silas Croft. He's been running his mouth. About the bounty, about you lying." "I know," Matthew said. "No, you don't," Eli said, his voice low and urgent. "Harlan was just doing his job, but Silas, he stirred up others. Men who ain't law. They're saying you're an Indian lover, that you're harboring a criminal. That $500 is a lot of money." Matthew's face hardened. "What are you saying, Eli?" "I'm saying they're coming back, not Harlan. Posse, a real one. They're calling you a traitor. Matthew, they ain't gonna just take her. They're gonna burn you out." Eli looked past him, at Saichi. He looked pained. You gotta get her out of here, Matthew, for your own good." "She is my woman, Eli," Matthew said, the words clear and cold. Eli's face fell. He had his answer. "God help you, Matthew, God help you both." He turned his horse and galloped away. Matthew stood in the yard. The sun was hot. The green plants were beautiful. And it was all over. He went inside. Saichi was standing by the half-dug hole, her face pale. She had heard. He began carrying his rifle with him, even at night. He would set it on the floor, next to the pallet, where he slept with her. He would wake at the sound of the wind, his hand reaching for the cold steel. They were trapped. That night, he pulled out his old, cracked map. He spread it on the floor by the firelight. "Here," he said, pointing to their small, doomed cabin. Then he traced a line with his finger. West, across the dry expanse, over the mountains. "Nevada," he said, "is far, new, land, new, names, no, one, knows, her, us." She looked at the map. She looked at the green plants, visible through the open door. She looked at the hole in the floor. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but full of stone. "This, our home. We build this, the crop. It lives." "The crop will burn," he said, his voice harsh. "We will burn. We leave tonight." "I not run," she said, her eyes flashing. "I am Apache. We do not run." "You are my woman," he said, his voice low and fierce. He grabbed her hand. "You are not Apache. You are not white. You are mine, and I am yours, and we will live." "You leave," she said, trying to pull her hand away. "I stay. I fight. I not harm you." He gripped her hand tighter. He pulled her to him. "You listen," he said. "I am not leaving without you. You stay. I stay. I stay. And I die. We leave together. Or we die together. You choose." She looked into his pale, gray eyes, now burning with a fire that matched her own. He meant it. He would not leave her. He would die here, in the dirt, next to her. She had been a punishment. She had been an outcast. Now she was his, and he was hers. She put her free hand on his face. "Together," she whispered. "We leave Nevada." The decision was made. Nevada. Together. The word hung in the cabin. A fragile new seed in the middle of a fire. They could not leave in the daylight. They would be seen. Tracked. "We wait," Matthew said, his voice low, his hand still holding hers. "The moon, it sets after midnight. We go before dawn." "Yes," she said. The word was solid. "Before dawn." The fear did not leave. It sharpened. It turned from a heavy, suffocating blanket into a cold, sharp blade. It gave them purpose. They moved not like victims, but like fugitives. He went to the small, half-dug hole in the floor. He kicked the dirt back in, tamping it down with his boot. They would not hide. They would run. "We pack," he said. They moved with a quiet, desperate efficiency. He took the last of his powder, the lead, the shot. He packed it in a dry canvas sack. He took his knife, the whetstone. He filled every water bag, even the one that leaked slowly. Water was life. Saichi worked beside him. She took the last of the cornmeal. She took the rabbit she had snared that morning. She took her small, precious pouch of herbs, the dried hawkswort and the spice she had brought from her people. "I cook," she said, holding the rabbit. "We need food for the ride." "No fire," he said, shaking his head. "The smoke, they see." "A small fire," she insisted. "Fast. I need more wood, the driest wood." She was right. To run for days. They needed sustenance, not raw flour. A hot meal might be their last for a week. He looked at the dying sun. It was a risk, a terrible risk, but she was right. "Go," he said. "Fast. I will watch the ridge. Do we not go far?" She took the small hatchet and slipped out the door. He watched her go. A small, strong figure moving quickly toward the arroyo, where the dead mesquite branches lay thickest. He turned, climbed the ladder to the loft, and grabbed the thick wool blanket, the one he had given her. He grabbed his own. They would need them. He was tying the blankets into a roll when he heard it. It was not the cautious approach of a single scout. It was the hard, pounding rhythm of horses pushed to a gallop. Many horses, He dropped the blankets, his blood turning to ice. He grabbed the rifle. "Saichi!" he roared, his voice tearing from his throat. He burst from the cabin door, scanning the land. He saw her. She was halfway from the arroyo, her arms full of wood. She had heard him. She had stopped, frozen. And then he saw them. They were not on the ridge. They were in the wash, using the low ground to hide their approach. 5 riders. They burst up over the lip of the wash, not 30 yards from her. In the lead was the man with the scar, the one from Harlan's posse, but beside him, his face a swollen, purple mask of hatred, was Silas Croft, and behind them, 3 other men, hard-faced, their rifles already out. "There!" Silas shrieked, his voice a cracked whistle, pointing at Saichi. "There's the Apache bitch!" Saichi dropped the wood and she ran. She did not run for the cabin. It was too far. She ran for the small cluster of rocks to her left, the only cover. "Saichi!" Matthew yelled again, bringing his rifle to his shoulder. The man with the scar spurred his horse, cutting her off. Matthew sighted on him, but the man was moving too fast, and Saichi was too close. He couldn't risk the shot. Another rider, a heavy man, looped his rope. It sailed through the air. Saichi ducked, the loop missing her by inches. Matthew fired. He aimed for the heavy man's horse. The shot was true. The horse screamed, a high, terrible sound, and pitched forward, its legs collapsing. The heavy man was thrown, rolling, his leg trapped beneath the dying animal. 1. The other riders scattered. Using the motion, the scarred man leveled his pistol and fired at the cabin. The shot bit into the wooden doorframe, inches from Matthew's head. Matthew ducked back, the splinters stinging his face. He heard her scream. It was not a cry of fear. It was a sound of pure rage, cut short by a heavy, wet thwack. He looked out again. His heart stopped. One of the riders had her. He had leaned down from his saddle and struck her with the butt of his pistol. She was on her knees, her head bowed. The scarred man leaped from his horse, grabbed her by the hair, and hauled her to her feet. She was limp. He saw blood in her black hair. "We got her!" the scarred man yelled. "Pike, get her tied!" "Matthew!" she cried out, one last time, a sound of such despair it tore his soul. "Let her go!" Matthew roared, stepping into the open, leveling his rifle. A shot came from the side. Silas. He was hiding behind his wagon, which he had brought. The bounty hunter's wagon. The shot went wide, but it forced Matthew back. In that moment, the scarred man and the one called Pike dragged Saichi to the wagon. Matthew saw it now. Bolted to the wagon bed was a heavy wooden cage, built for an animal, with a thick padlock. They threw her in, not pushed, threw her, like a sack of feed. The scarred man slammed the door, slapped the lock on it. "He's in the cabin!" Silas screamed, his courage returning. "He shot Pike! Let's burn him! Burn him out!" The scarred man, Cole, looked at Pike, who was still pinned, screaming curses. "To hell with him! Evans, get his horse. We got what we came for. Let's get to the fort. Get our money." "What about Bell?" the other rider, Evans, asked, his rifle trained on the cabin. "He's one man." Cole spat. "He's trapped. He ain't going nowhere. Let him rot." The men mounted. Pike, his leg broken, was hauled onto the back of Evans's horse. The scarred man lashed the wagon team. Matthew ran from the cabin, his rifle up. "No!" He fired. He hit the wagon. The sound a dull thud. He fired again. The bullet zinged off the iron rim of a wheel. He chambered another round. Cole turned in his saddle, raised his rifle, and fired. Matthew felt a white-hot poker sear his left arm. He stumbled, his own shot going wide. He looked down. Blood was spreading, dark and fast, across his sleeve. The wagon, with its terrible cargo, lurched, gained speed, and disappeared over the ridge, followed by the riders. He stood there, panting, the blood dripping from his fingers into the dust. The yard was empty, save for the screaming, dying horse. He did not feel the pain in his arm. He felt nothing. The world was silent. His breath, his life, it was in that cage. He went to the dying horse. The animal looked at him, its eyes wild with pain. Matthew raised his rifle, placed the muzzle against its head, and fired. The sound was flat, final. He turned and walked back to his cabin. The door was open. He stepped inside. They had been here. While he was pinned, one of them had come in. It was not just a search, it was a violation. The table was overturned. The chairs, broken. His pallet and her pallet, their pallet, which they had shared, was slashed. The ticking ripped open, the straw scattered like chaff. Her herbs, her precious pouch, was torn. The contents scattered on the dirt floor, ground under a boot. He walked to the hearth, his feet crunching on his own spilled cornmeal. He knelt. The floorboards where the locket had been were ripped up. The locket, his last tie to his old life, was gone, taken. They had not just taken her. They had come into his home and torn out its heart. They had erased her. They had erased them. Matthew Bell, the farmer, the widower, the man who had been dead for 2 years, ceased to exist. He knelt in the ruins of his life. His face, which had learned to smile, settled into a mask of stone, of cold, of an absolute and terrible calm. He stood. He went to the water bucket. He ripped a strip of cloth from a ruined shirt and tore it with his teeth. He poured water on his bleeding arm. The wound was high, through the muscle, but the bone was not hit. He bound it, his movement steady, tight, his jaw clenched. He went to the canvas sack he had been packing. He took the powder. He took the lead. He took his knife. He took the 2 remaining water bags. He stuffed a handful of the spilled cornmeal, grit and all, into his mouth and chewed. He went to the corral. Jed, the mule, was braying, spooked by the gunfire. "Quiet," Matthew said. His voice was not his own. It was a dry rasp. He saddled the mule. He mounted. He looked at the tracks in the dust, the deep ruts of the wagon wheels. They headed southeast, toward Fort Verde, toward the Bounty. He did not look back at the cabin. It was a grave. He kicked the mule and rode. He rode for 2 days. The desert was an anvil. The sun was the hammer. The mule was slow, but it was relentless. It did not complain. Neither did Matthew. He did not feel the throb in his arm. He did not feel the sun on his cracked lips. He did not feel the hunger in his belly. He just watched the tracks. The wide double ruts were his compass, his religion. He rode through the night, the moon a bright, cold eye. He walked the mule to spare it, pulling it up rocky slopes, his boots filling with sand. He drank sparingly, a single hot, metallic sip every hour. He gave the mule the same. The land changed. The flat earth gave way to a broken, wind-swept wilderness of red rock and dry canyons. On the second day, the wind rose. It started as a whisper, a high, thin sound, like a woman weeping. Then it grew. It became a moan, a roar. It came from the north, a physical wall of moving air, carrying sand that stung his face, that filled his eyes, that made the world a hazy, yellow hell. He pulled his hat low. He tied a cloth over his face. He kept moving. But the tracks were fading. The wind was a cruel, living thing. It was wiping the ruts clean, filling them with sand. He pushed the mule harder, faster. The animal grunted, its head low. By noon on the second day, he stopped. He stood in a vast, empty expanse of rock. The tracks were gone. The wind howled around him, mocking him. He was alone. He had lost them. He turned, a full circle. There was nothing, just rock and sand and wind. "No," he whispered. the word was stolen from his mouth by the gale. No. He was lost. He sank to his knees. The mule nudged his back. He had failed. He was going to die here, in this godless place. And she would be sold, handled. Worse. A cold, black despair settled on him. He felt the pull of the earth, the dust he had come from. It would be so easy to lie down, to sleep. He closed his eyes. He saw her face. He saw her, the night of the nightmare, her hand on his chest. He saw her face bruised, being thrown in the cage. He saw the hawk she had healed, flying, free. He stood up. He was not an Apache. He was not a tracker, but he was a farmer. He knew the land, and he was a man. He knew men. They had a wagon. They were lazy. They would not take the hard way. They would follow the low ground. They would follow the dry washes, the old water routes. He looked at the sun, a pale, useless disk behind the dust, southeast. He took a drink. The water bag was almost empty. He gave the last of it to the mule. He had one bag left. He got on the mule. He pointed it southeast, into the teeth of the wind. He rode until the sun set. He rode until he was dizzy, his arm a dull, hot fire. He was dying of thirst. His tongue was a piece of wood. His head was light. He was going to die. He topped one last low mesa, the mule stumbling. He was ready to fall. And he smelled it. Through the sand, through the wind, smoke. A greasy, acrid smell, bacon and man-sweat. He slid from the mule, his legs collapsing. He crawled the last few feet to the edge of the rise. He looked down. There, in a deep, dry ravine, sheltered from the worst of the wind, was a camp. The wagon, 4 horses, 4 men. Cole, the scarred man. Evans, the one called Pike, his legs splinted, sitting near the fire. And Silas Croft, his back to Matthew, frying bacon in a pan. Matthew's heart, which he thought had turned to stone, gave a single hard jolt. He saw them. He saw the wagon. He saw the cage, bolted to the back. He saw a shape inside, a bundle of rags. It was not moving. He lay on his belly, his rifle stock cold against his cheek. "She ain't moved all day," Pike said, his voice grating. "She's tough," Cole said. "She'll fetch a price. The captain at Verde loves supplies. He'll give us powder, whiskey. Better than cash." "Traitor," Silas whined. "I want the $500. I want to teach her a lesson first, for my face." "You'll get your share." Cole spat. "And you'll touch her when I say, 'She's cargo. Damaged cargo don't sell.'" "What about Bell?" Evans asked, looking back into the storm. "That farmer. He's a hard man. He shot Pike clean." "He's dead," Cole said, dismissing him. "He's face down in the dust, his arm full of poison. He's not coming." Matthew watched. He did not move. He lay in the sand, the wind tearing at him, and he waited. Night fell. The wind did not die. It screamed, a shroud over the desert. The men ate. They passed a bottle. "I'll take first watch," Cole said. "You two sleep." He gestured to Evans and Pike. "Silas, you're worthless. Sleep under your wagon." Pike and Evans rolled into their blankets by the dying fire. Silas, looking nervous, crawled under the wagon, near the cage. Cole sat on a rock, his back to the ravine wall, his rifle across his lap. He faced the way they had come. Matthew waited. He did not feel the cold. He did not feel his arm. He was a piece of the rock. He waited 1 hour, 2. He waited until the fire was nothing but red, winking eyes. He waited until Cole's head, outlined against the faint moonlight, nodded once. He left the mule tied on the ridge. He slid, like a snake, down the sandy slope. He did not approach from the front. He circled, the long way. He came up from behind the ravine, the way they were going. No one ever watches the way they are going. The wind covered every sound. His boots made no whisper. He was behind Cole. The man was dozing, his chin on his chest. Matthew took his knife. He did not want a shot. Not yet. He moved. 5 feet, 3 feet. Cole sensed him. A change in the air. His head snapped up. Who? Matthew's hand clamped over the man's mouth. He did not drive the knife in. He was a farmer. He was strong. He wrapped his wounded arm around the man's chest, and he squeezed. He put his other hand, his good hand, on the man's throat. He did not stab, he strangled. Cole fought, his boots kicking, his hands clawing at Matthew's arms, but Matthew's grip was iron. He was killing a wolf. He held on, his face a mask, until the struggling stopped, until the man went limp. He eased the body to the ground. He took the man's rifle. He took his pistol. 1. He looked at the camp. 2 forms in blankets by the embers. Pike, Evans. 1 form under the wagon, Silas. He looked at the cage. In the faint, stormy light, he saw her. She was not sleeping. Her eyes were open. They were fixed on him, black, wide, and full of a terrible, waiting stillness. She was gagged. Her hands were bound. He put 1 finger to his lips. He walked into the camp. He stood over the 2 sleeping men. He had 2 rifles. He was 10 feet away. He raised the rifle. He aimed at the center of the first blanket. He fired. The sound tore the night. The blanket jumped. He aimed at the second. He fired. The second blanket convulsed, then was still. "What? What in God's name?" Silas screamed. He scrambled from under the wagon, his pistol in his hand, his eyes wild. He saw the 2 dead men. He saw Cole's body. He saw Matthew, standing like an angel of death, the rifle smoking in his hand. "Belle!" Silas shrieked, his voice breaking. You're dead!" "You touched her," Matthew said. His voice was the sound of the wind, the sound of the rock. Silas raised his pistol, his hands shaking. Matthew raised his rifle. "Wait!" Silas whimpered. The money, the bounty, we can split it." Matthew fired. The shot hit Silas in the chest. He was thrown back, hard, against the wagon wheel. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain, his eyes wide with a terrible, final surprise. He slid to the ground. Dead, all of them. The silence that fell was absolute. There was only the wind. Matthew dropped the rifle. He ran to the cage. Saichi. He fumbled with the padlock. It was thick. "The key." She shook her head, her eyes frantic. "Cole." He ran to Cole's body. He felt the man's pockets. Nothing. Silas. He searched the trader. A key. He ran back. His hands were shaking now, the strength leaving him. He put the key in the lock. It didn't turn. It was the wrong key. He roared, a sound of pure frustration. He picked up the rifle. He put the muzzle against the heavy iron loop of the lock. "Turn, face," he yelled. She understood. She pressed herself into the back of the cage, shielding her face. He pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The lock shattered, the metal flying. He tore the broken hasp away, his hand ripping open on the sharp metal. He didn't feel it. He pulled the cage door open. She crawled out, her hands tied, the gag still in her mouth. She fell at his feet. He knelt, pulling his knife. He cut the ropes on her wrists. He cut the gag from her mouth. She took a deep, shuddering breath of the sandy air. She did not cry. She looked at his bloody hand. She looked at his bleeding arm. She looked at the dead men. She tried to stand. Her legs buckled. He lifted her. He lifted her in his arms, as if she weighed nothing, and he carried her out of the ravine, away from the slaughter, under the moonless, storm-racked sky. He found his mule. He put her on it. He walked beside her, his hand on her leg. holding her steady. The storm was at its peak. The air was a solid, moving wall of sand. They could not go on. He saw a shadow, a dark line in the rock, an overhang, a shallow ledge. He pulled the mule in. He pulled her down from the saddle. He pushed her back, under the stone, out of the worst of the wind. He pulled the mule in tight, a living wall against the storm. They collapsed. They huddled together, the world tearing itself to pieces around them. The sand poured in, covering their legs. She was shaking, a deep bone-rattling tremor. He pulled her into his lap. He turned his back to the wind, shielding her with his body. He wrapped his arms around her and held on. "You are punishment," she whispered, her voice broken, her face buried in his chest. "I am a curse." "No," he said, his voice raw, fierce. He held her face, forcing her to look at him. His hands were covered in his blood. Her blood. Their blood. "You are not punishment," he whispered, the words torn from the deepest part of him. "You are my breath. You are my life. You are my home." She looked at him, this man who had been a ghost, this man who had just killed 4 men for her, this farmer with the blood of her captors on his hands. She saw the raw gash on his hand. She saw the dark stain on his arm. She saw the storm in his pale, gray eyes. She leaned up, her body shaking, and she kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion. It was not a kiss of comfort. It was a kiss of survival. It tasted of blood and gunpowder and the grit of the sand. It was a claiming. It was a promise. He kissed her back, his grip crushing, pulling her so close they were one person. They were not bound by desire. They were not bound by loneliness. They were bound, now, by blood, by survival. The sandstorm raged around them, and they clung to each other, 2 broken souls, forged into one in the heart of the desert fire. The sandstorm raged for a full day, a howling, yellow blindness that sealed them in their rock shelter. They did not speak. They huddled together. 2 survivors in the belly of the beast. Saichi, her hands shaking but her touch sure, tore strips from her own skirt. She cleaned his arm wound with the last of the water from his bag, her fingers probing, finding no shattered bone. She packed it with a mash of herbs she'd kept tied in her hair, a healer's instinct surviving even the cage. He, in turn, tended her. His large, rough hands were clumsy, but his touch was light. He cleaned the blood from her scalp where the pistol butt had struck her. The gash was deep. He tore a strip from his own shirt and bound her head, his eyes dark with a fury that had not yet cooled. When the wind finally died, the world was scoured clean. The sky was a pale, bruised blue. The bodies of the men in the ravine were already half covered in new drifts of sand. They did not speak of the dead. They were just gone. Matthew scavenged. He took the 2 horses that were strongest. He took Cole's rifle, his pistol, his full powder horn. He found their water bags, filled at some spring he had not known. He took their sacks of flour, bacon, and coffee. He found Silas's small pouch of coins and gold dust. He took that, too. He looked at the wagon, at the cage. His face hardened. He looked at Saichi, who stood by the new horses, her back to the ravine. He took the trader's oil can and emptied it on the wagon wheels, on the cage, on the body of Silas Croft. He struck a match. The fire caught with a whoosh, the black smoke staining the clean morning sky. He walked away from the fire, looped the mule's rope to one of the saddles, and mounted. He held his hand down to Saichi. She took it, and he pulled her up, seating her behind him on the strong horse. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her body pressed against his back. "Where?" she whispered against his shirt. He looked at the tracks they had made, leading back to the cabin. Then he looked west, toward the unknown mountains, toward Nevada. "First," he said, his voice a low rasp, "we finish it." They rode east, back toward the cabin. It took them 2 days, riding slow, sparing the horses. They spoke little. They were bound by the blood they had spilled and the blood they had shared. They were no longer two people. They were one unit, moving across the desert, a single, determined shadow. They arrived at the shack at twilight. It was as they had left it, a violated, broken thing. The door hung open. The inside was a ruin, his life and her life scattered and torn. He saw the green plants in the garden, the squash vines, the strong beanstalks, all coated in the dust of the posse's arrival, their hope. Saichi dismounted. She walked into the cabin. She stood over the slashed pallet. She looked at the herbs ground into the dirt floor. She looked at the hiding place, the half-dug hole that was now just a scar. Matthew walked to the hill behind the house. He stood for a long time, looking at the 2 mounds of stones. Sarah, his son. He said his goodbyes. He had said them years ago, but this was the final one. He was no longer the man who had buried them. That man was gone, lost in the desert. He walked back to the cabin. Saichi was standing on the porch, waiting. She knew what he was going to do. "It is a grave," he said. He was not talking about the hill. He was talking about the cabin. "Yes," she said. "The ghosts are hungry." He went inside. He found the can of lamp oil, miraculously upright in a corner. He began to pour it. He poured it on the dirt floor, on the ripped bedding, on the broken chair, on the floorboards where his locket had been stolen. He walked out. He stood beside her in the yard. He struck a single match. The tiny flame was bright in the dusk. He looked at her. Her face was calm, resolute. He tossed the match through the doorway. The oil caught with a hungry breath. The flames were blue, then yellow, then a raging, roaring orange. They licked up the dry wood, burst through the sod roof. The cabin became a pyre, a column of fire and smoke that lit the high desert for miles. They stood and watched. They watched the walls collapse. They watched the roof fall in. They watched their old lives, their pain, their punishment, their grief, be consumed and turned to ash. He watched the last 2 years of his failure burn. She watched her shame, her exile, her time in the cage, turn to smoke. When it was nothing but a glowing red square on the earth, he turned. "Now," he said, "Nevada." He helped her onto her horse. He mounted his own. They turned their backs on the fire, on the 2 graves on the hill, on the green garden that would wither in the heat. They rode west, and they did not look back. The journey was long. It was weeks, not days. They crossed the great empty basin, a land of salt flats and shadow-black mountains. They rode until Arizona was a memory, a bad dream. They rode until the land began to rise, to turn green, to breathe. They found it in the high mountains of Nevada, a hollow, tucked away, shielded from the wind by high pine-covered ridges. A creek, cold and clear, ran through the center. The grass was knee-high. There were aspen and spruce, and the air was so clean it hurt to breathe. Matthew stopped his horse. He looked at the water. He looked at the sky. He looked at the rich, dark earth. "Here," he said. Saichi slid from her horse. She walked to the creek, knelt, and dipped her hands in the water. She drank. She looked up at him, the clear, cold water dripping from her chin. "Here," she whispered. It took them the rest of the summer and all of the fall. He had the golden coins from the posse. He rode 30 miles down the mountain to a small, rough settlement called Pine Creek. He bought tools, an axe, an adze, a saw, nails. He bought glass. He was a farmer, but his father had been a carpenter. The skills came back. Sleeping in his hands, he felled the pines. He squared the logs. Saichi worked beside him. She was not a helper. She was a builder. She stripped the bark. She helped him haul the logs. She mixed the mud and stone for the chinking, her hands strong and sure. The house he built was not the sagging, miserable shack of the desert. It was smaller, but it was strong. The logs were tight. The roof was pitched steep against the snow he knew would come. He built a hearth of heavy river stone, wide and deep. And he built windows, not small, dark holes. He built wide, clear windows, using the glass he had bought. "So, you can see the sky," he told her, as he set the first pane. She touched the cool, smooth glass. "So, we can see what comes," she answered. While he built the walls, she built the earth. This land was not an enemy. It was a partner. She did not plant beans and corn, not at first. She walked the mountainside, her eyes scanning, and she found what she needed. She found the herbs of her people, growing wild in this new land. She planted a garden by the new cabin door. It was not a garden for food. It was a garden for life. A medicine garden. Yarrow for fevers. Sage for cleansing. Wild bergamot for his arm, which still ached in the damp. She was reclaiming her knowledge, not as a secret, but as their strength. They moved in just as the first snows began to dust the high peaks. Life settled. It was a quiet life, a hard life, but it was theirs. The settlement at Pine Creek needed someone to teach their children, not reading or writing, though he knew how. They needed someone to teach them how to live in this high, rough country. The settlers were miners, shopkeepers. They did not know the land. Matthew Bell, the failed farmer of Arizona, knew. He had learned from the desert. He had learned from Saichi. He taught the settlement children how to read the seasons, how to know which trees were strong, how to find water, how to plant small, hardy crops that would survive the short, mountain summer. They called him Mr. Bell. They paid him in flour, in sugar, in cloth, in coffee. He would ride home on the mule. Jed, the bags full, and he was not the stooped, broken man. He was a provider, a teacher. And he would come home to the cabin, to the smell of her cooking, the scent of pine smoke and roasting meat. One afternoon, in the second spring, he did not go to the settlement. He took her hand. He said nothing. He walked her down to the creek, to a place where a single, ancient cottonwood stood, its new leaves a pale, bright green. "We need no paper," he said, his voice quiet. "We need no town, no preacher." He took his knife, the one he had used to kill Cole, the one he used to skin rabbits. He touched the thick, rough bark of the tree. "This is the church," he said. He carved a letter into the bark, a simple, deep S. "This is the law." He carved next to it an M. He stood back, S-A and D-M, side by side. He turned to her. He took her hands. "You are my wife." She looked at him, her dark eyes clear, holding his. She leaned forward and touched her fingers to the raw carving in the tree. "You are my husband," she said. There were no witnesses, only the creek and the sky and the tree that would bear their mark as long as it lived. The past did not die. It was not a thing that could be burned or buried. It lived in them. It was part of the house they built. Some nights, the wind would hit the pine trees, and it would make a high, whining sound, like the sandstorm, like the sound of the cage door. Saichi would wake, her body rigid, a small, choked sound in her throat. She would be back in the wagon, her hands tied, the darkness pressing in. She would lash out, her hands fists, her legs kicking. Matthew did not try to gentle her with words. He knew words were useless against such terror. He would simply hold her. He would wrap his arms around her, pinning her, his body a solid living anchor. "Is me," he would whisper, his mouth against her hair. Matthew, you are safe. I am here. You are home." He would hold her, his strength a wall around her, until the shaking stopped, until her fists uncurled, until she would turn and bury her face in his chest. Clinging to him, he would hold her until she slept. And he had his own ghosts. Sometimes, in the deep of winter, he would sit by the fire long after she was asleep. He would stare into the flames, his face empty, his eyes seeing the dust of Arizona. He would see Sarah's face, pale and begging for water. He would see the tiny, still bundle he had buried on the hill. The grief was a part of his bones. It would never leave him. Saichi would wake. She would see him, a silhouette of sorrow against the fire. She would rise from their bed, the wool blanket soft. She would not go to him. She would not touch him. She would sit on the floor, near his feet, her back to the warm stones of the hearth, and she would sing. It was not a lament. It was a song of her people, a low, rhythmic chant, a song for the night, for the stars, for the deep, cold earth. It was the sound of her culture, the one that had cast her out. He would sit, unmoving, and let the sound wash over him. He did not understand the words. He did not need to. Her voice, her heritage, the very thing that had been her crime, was now his solace. It filled the small, strong house, and it quieted the ghosts. As the years passed, new settlers found the hollow. They were drawn by the water, by the shelter. They would come, curious, to the small, strong cabin with the wide windows. They saw the quiet, gray-haired man and his dark, silent wife. They saw the thriving medicine garden, the solid fences, the peace that hung in the air. They would ask, as strangers do, "You folks been here long?" While," Matthew would say. Where you from?" "Arizona Territory," a new woman asked one day, sharing a cup of coffee. "You don't talk like you're from around here." Matthew looked at Saichi. She was across the room, grinding herbs, her hands steady, her face calm. He looked back at the woman. "We built everything ourselves," he said. It was the only answer they ever gave. It was the only answer that mattered. The snows came, the snows melted, the aspen turned to fire, then to skeletons, then to green again. 10 years passed, 15. It was winter, the first deep snow of the season. The world was white, silent, and clean. Matthew stood on the porch, his hand on the smooth pine rail. His hair was white, his arm was stiff, but it was strong. Saichi came out. Her black hair was streaked with silver, pulled back in its simple, strong braid. She stood beside him. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. It was an easy, familiar motion, a gesture worn smooth by thousands of days. They stood together, watching the snow fall on her garden, covering the dormant herbs in a thick, white blanket. The air was cold, pure. She spoke, her voice a quiet murmur, almost lost in the stillness. "You were never my punishment." He looked down at the top of her head. He breathed in the cold air, the smell of her hair, of wood smoke, of home. He held her tighter. He looked out at the white, clean world they had built, the one they had earned. He answered, his voice rough, but full of a truth that was deeper than any grave, stronger than any fire. "You were my home." Thank you for listening to this story. We truly hope it found a home in your heart. We would love to know where you are listening from tonight. Please, drop a comment and let us know what part of the world you are in. If you enjoyed this journey, we invite you to subscribe to From Wild West for more stories just like this one. And finally, please share your thoughts on Matthew and Saichi's story, in English, in the comments below. We read every one.